Miles Kennedy, Ryan Bean. Our topic was the prologue in Chapter 1. We will start with the prologue, the story of psychology. Some basic psychological questions that most of us have asked ourselves before. When you react to something as your mom or dad would, and you wonder how much of your personality you inherited. Have you ever wondered what babies perceive and think when you play a game of peekaboo with them? Psychology is a science that seeks to answer all sorts of questions about how we all think, feel, and act. Psychology's roots. Ever since the beginning of time, people have been intensely interested in themselves. They wondered, who are we? Where do our feeling, thoughts, and actions come from? Psychology answers these questions as is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Pre-scientific psychology. It started in ancient Greece. The philosopher Socrates and his student Plato concluded that mind is separable from body and that knowledge is born within us. Aristotle, though, differently, and he believed that knowledge grew from experiences. John Locke, a philosopher, came up with the idea that the mind was a blank slate and that experiences wrote on it. This helped form empiricism, which is the view that knowledge originates in experience and that science should, therefore, rely on observation and experimentation. So psychological science is born. Many new branches of psychology formed. Edward Bradford came up with the idea of structuralism. Structuralism used introspection. Bradford would train people to report elements of their experience as they looked at a rose, smelled a scent, or tasted something familiar. Another branch of psychology was proposed by William James. It was called functionalism. Functionalism was a school of psychology that focused on how mental and behavioral processes function and how they enable the organism to adapt, survive, and flourish. It didn't take long until psychological science developed. Psychology developed into a more established field of philosophy and biology. From the 1920s into the 1960s, psychology changed into the scientific study of observational behavior. You can observe people's behavior as they responded to different situations. Psychology's big debate. The nature versus nurture debate concerns the relative contributions of biology and experience. Do our human traits develop through experience, or do we come equipped with them? One of the largest terms in psychology is natural selection. This was proposed by Charles Darwin, and natural selection stated that nature selects those that best enable an organism to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. The genes contributing to survival and reproduction will most likely get passed on to children. Psychology's perspectives. Psychology involves many different perspectives. Someone who has neuroscience perspective studies brain circuits that cause someone to become red in the face. An evolutionary perspective analyzes how anger facilitated the survival of our ancestors' genes. Behavior genetics studies how heredity and experience influence our differences in temperament. A psychodynamic view might view an outburst as an outlet for unconscious hostility. Behavioral perspective studies facial expressions, and cognitive perspective studies how anger affects our thinking. Social cultural might explore which situations produced most anger in people and how expressions of anger vary across cultures. Difference between applied and basic research. Basic research is pure science that aims to increase the scientific knowledge base. Applied research is a scientific study that aims to solve practical problems. Types of psychologists. Counseling psychologists assist people with problems in living, related to school, work, or marriage. Clinical psychologists study, assess, and treat people with psychological disorders. Psychiatrists can prescribe medications to people dealing with psychological disorders. The case study. One of the oldest methods of research that involves a process in which psychologists study one individual in great depth in hope of revealing things true of us all. John Piaget taught us about children thinking after carefully observing and questioning a few children. The survey. The survey method of research looks at many cases in less depth. A survey is a technique for ascertaining the self-reported attitudes or behaviors of people, usually by questioning a representative. A random sample is a sample that fairly represents a population because each member has an equal chance of inclusion. The population is all the cases in a group from which samples may be drawn for study. Naturalistic observation. Another research method involves watching and recording behavior of organisms in their natural environment. This is called naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation involves watching chimpanzee societies in the jungle to parent-child interaction in different cultures. Correlation. Two things correlate when surveys and naturalistic observations reveal that one trait or behavior accompanies another. These two correlate. Scatter plots show correlations because each plot plots the value of two variables. There are three types of correlations: negative, positive, and no correlation. An example of negative correlation is the more TV that is on in the home of young children, the less time they spend reading. An example of positive correlation: the more sexual content teens see on TV, the more likely they are to have sex. Illusory correlation is when we believe there is a relationship between two things, we are more likely to recall our own evidence to support our belief.